Smoke drifted low through the alleys, clinging to broken rebar and splintered shutters as though the village itself were exhaling. Chunks of concrete lay where walls had once stood. Doors no longer marked thresholds, only holes in burned-out stone. The cratered street buckled in places where mortars had landed hours earlier, and the last functioning radio lay cracked in the mud, spitting nothing but static. Dust lifted with every breath, every shift of weight, curling in slow spirals through the late-day light. No birds, no engines, just the low groan of something still burning inside the collapsed clinic. Corporal Lewis crouched near the edge of a rubble pile, hands shaking as he fed the last of his magazines into his chest rig. He didn't speak. No one did. Just across from him, Lance Corporal Vega was rolling a cigarette with fingers streaked in ash and blood. He struck the lighter with a practiced snap and dragged the smoke long. Not for comfort, just for rhythm. Behind them, Private Calloway sat with his head down, quietly scratching initials into the stock of his rifle. His breathing stuttered every few seconds like he'd forgotten how lungs worked. The squad leader, Sergeant Wynne, stood under what remained of a collapsed awning, scanning a crumpled map that had long since stopped meaning anything. The satellite overlays were weeks old. Everything on the page was redrawn in smudged pencil and crossed-out arrows. His radio wasn't working, but he kept the headset on, listening to the deadline. When someone asked if command had answered, he didn't respond. There was movement at the end of the street. 4 silhouettes advanced through the haze, enemy scouts in staggered formation, rifles raised, posture deliberate. No one fired. There was no good angle. Wynne lifted his hand in a slow signal to hold position. His jaw set, his expression unreadable. Then the front scout dropped. Not staggered, not tripped, just gone. No report of a rifle. No muzzle flash. 1 second he was there. The next, he was face down in the dust. The others froze. So did the Marines. Corporal Lewis blinked hard and whispered, "Was that ours?" Nobody answered. The dust kept swirling, half-light catching on the shape of the fallen enemy. The air held still, like something just stopped watching. The operations tent smelled of sun-warped canvas and burnt instant coffee. Screens flickered with grid overlays, but no one was watching them. At the back table, a junior analyst shrugged as he scrolled through the most recent personnel updates. Sergeant Rachel Knox recon detail. Last pinged 2 days ago, hadn't checked in. Her last message had been a burst of static and 2 garbled words. Probably wind shear. The log read, MIA, presumed compromised. The officer signing the report didn't ask for clarification. There were bigger priorities now. They said, no time to chase ghosts in contested sectors. She would be flagged for review after the op. Far from the chatter and clipped keyboards, Rachel lay prone in the shattered upper floor of an old stone church. The steeple had collapsed years ago, leaving jagged timber beams and loose shingles scattered across the dusty floor. Her position overlooked a grid of alleyways and broken rooftops, an unobstructed angle that no one else had noticed. Wind whistled through the holes in the wall. The cold didn't bother her. Her rifle rested on a sandbag perch. Bolt action. Suppressed. Wrapped in dull tape to reduce shine. Next to it lay a folded wind chart held down by a rusted bolt and a pencil worn to half its length. Her notebook was open across her lap, edges curled from moisture. The pages were tight with handwriting ranges, movement patterns, timestamps. Each sketch was marked with red slashes and notes on behavior: who led, who hesitated, who relayed commands. She listened. In the distance, a dull percussion rolled across the valley. Artillery, maybe 5 clicks out. The sound told her more than any briefing ever had. Based on the echo, it was likely 122 millimeter, maybe towed from the south. She jotted it down. No food left. But she wasn't hungry. The cold. The hours, none of it mattered. The radio at her side hissed again, a low crackle, just static this time. She turned the volume down and never touched the transmit key. It was there more for rhythm than connection. a reminder of what she'd chosen to leave behind. She flipped the notebook closed, adjusted the optic on her scope by a fraction, then returned to the glass. Below, two figures moved cautiously behind a collapsed wall. Patrol timing was tightening. She watched without blinking. "Not yet," she whispered, and resumed the watch. The rounds came in closer now. Not sporadic anymore, patterned, aimed, tightening like a noose around the broken street. Debris kicked up in rhythmic bursts as if the buildings themselves were being raked for breath. Sergeant Wynne ducked low behind a blown-out water trough, counting between mortar splashes. The last one hit less than 20 meters out. The blast knocked over a rusted street sign and ruptured a line of stacked bricks. Private Calloway rolled onto his side, stunned, bleeding from one ear. He blinked at the sky like it had punched him. Corporal Lewis dragged him back toward the alley mouth, hand pressing hard to his own leg where shrapnel had torn through the fatigues. Across the lane, Lance Corporal Vega had his head buried in a pouch, fumbling for the medkit with blood-slicked fingers. The screaming had stopped a while ago, but no one said it. They just moved quieter. Wynne took the cracked binoculars from his vest and tried again. The left lens was fractured from the first wave, but the right still gave him slivers of movement across the northern wall, shapes flanked wide, slipping through cover. They weren't rushing anymore. They were herding. A mortar crew assembled behind a scorched car frame. One of them shouted, raising a hand to signal. Then he dropped. No warning. No echo. Just down. "Who fired?" Wynne barked, instinctively looking left, then right. "No one's hot," Vega called from behind cover. "That wasn't us." Wynne turned the radio dial again. "Desperate. Reaper. Actual. This is Delta 5. Do you copy? Repeat. Do you—" Static. Another figure fell, this one on the rooftop, scope glinting just once before he jerked backward, arms flailing, body limp. Vega's voice dropped low. "We get air. Are we on the schedule?" Wynne didn't answer. The feed was dead. No one had called shots. They were boxed in, down to half ammo, and now the enemy's top cover was falling one by one. Someone in the back whispered, "Maybe it's a forward scout. One of ours." "No one's out that far," Lewis murmured. "Not unless they were dropped a week ago." Another enemy went down mid-sprint. The platoon stilled. From above, a crow lifted off a rooftop and circled twice, feathers catching light as it passed over the wreckage. Vega pulled his helmet tighter and looked up at the steeple no one had mentioned all day. "It's not us," he said quietly. "But someone's watching." No one spoke after that. Not even Wynne. For the first time in hours, no one moved, and no one died. The silence held like a breath. No one wanted to exhale. Rachel Knox had not moved in hours. The cold had settled beneath her uniform, curling into the soft space behind her knees and wrapping along her spine. But she ignored it. Stillness was part of the shape, her left elbow pressed into the folded blanket beneath her chest, giving just enough elevation to keep her shoulder level. The cracked stone beneath her was dusted with broken plaster and flakes of old paint. Overhead, the rusted iron bell hung at an angle from a fractured beam, silent in its broken mount. Around her, the ruin of the steeple opened in wide slats and jagged lines where stained glass had once caught the light. Now it filtered through in slow-moving shafts, pale and angled, barely warming the air. Her rifle was simple, bolt action, matte black beneath layers of wrapped fabric to muffle the sound and kill reflection. The scope had a shallow scratch near the edge of the glass, not deep enough to distort her sight picture, but enough to remind her to hold just a little right when the angle changed. She kept her face still, eyes forward, mouth closed, every breath measured in tempo with the air. Below, through the lens, movement traced a familiar rhythm, a team of 4, ducking across cover, one lagging behind. The lead man signaled, raised a hand to halt. Rachel didn't look at their faces. She watched their feet, the weight shift. The moment hesitation, broke into momentum. She marked timing against the tree's sway, wind from left to right, just under 3 knots. Midday heat, shimmer distorted the alley beyond them, but only faintly. She turned a page in her notebook. Her handwriting was clean, slanted, full of symbols only she understood. She marked their route, drew a square around the tall figure with the shoulder bag. RTO. She circled the mortar crew's last known position, double-lined the arrow extending toward the north end of the square. Then she fired. No words, no tension, just one squeeze. The rifle bucked gently against her shoulder. The figure in the scope dropped behind cover before the others realized. She did not watch the reaction. That wasn't the part that mattered. She reached for her laminated wind chart, smudged now from old rain and the crease where her thumb always pressed. Her blood dry from 2 days ago left a faint stain across Sector 5. She shifted the scope elevation 1 tick up, dialed for distance, reset her sightline. Then, she waited again. Outside, dust drifted in slow spirals above the rooftops. Through the lens, silhouettes moved like shadows across the haze, fragile, predictable, easy to break. But that wasn't why she was here. She watched because no one else did. They stacked behind what was left of a corner shop, 2 walls and a steel-framed doorway with no door. Sergeant Wynne raised 2 fingers, made a quick chopping motion. The alley was 20 meters wide, exposed in the center, with scattered debris from a collapsed power pole. Just enough to duck behind if they moved fast. Corporal Ellis was first up. He tapped Private Farley on the shoulder, then nodded to Nguyen. Farley took a breath and sprinted. Nguyen followed. Boots slapped concrete as they dashed toward the middle, ducked behind an overturned cabinet. Wynne signaled for the next, but Ellis hesitated, scanning. It felt too easy. Then he went. Mid-run. The air cracked. A burst of machine gun fire tore through the right wall, chewing into the dirt and brick. Ellis stumbled. His leg folded and the helmet flew from his head, bounced once, then rolled into the alley. Dust spiraled around him, kicked up by the round still digging in behind. MG right wall breach, top floor, someone shouted. Ellis clawed for the side, dragging himself with one hand. The machine gun swung, about to correct for the kill shot. Then the gunner's body pitched backward. No sound, just the sudden absence of fire. The weapon slipped from its mount and clattered to the floor above. The silence that followed was louder than the burst had been. Move! Move! Grab him! Wynne's voice cracked through the dust. Farley darted out, grabbed Ellis by the vest straps and hauled him toward cover. Nguyen rushed forward, scooped up the helmet, and threw it in after them. They landed hard against the wall, breathing in gasps. Ellis stared at the ceiling above, dirt on his teeth, his leg shaking. I thought that was it, he muttered. You should be gone, Nguyen said, checking his leg. He had you cold. Ellis stared into the alley. Whoever that is, they're watching. No one spoke after that. Wynne checked angles again, slower this time, more deliberate. The alley looked the same. No change in light, no movement, no sound beyond the slow fall of settling dust. But something had shifted. The squad adjusted position. Tighter now. Quieter. When Wynne gave the next signal, no one moved until the wind carried the dust just enough to show clean sky. No one said what they were thinking, but they felt it. Someone was there, not just protecting them, reading the field, watching for the moments that counted. The operations tent was dim, lit by one hanging bulb and the flicker of 3 tired monitors. An analyst hunched over a keyboard, scrolling through aerial overlays as if looking for a reason to care. Rachel stood beside him, her boots planted steady, field notebook tucked under one arm. The analyst didn't glance up as he spoke. That sector's cold. No traffic. No satellite movement in 72 hours. Rachel kept her voice calm. They're not using roads. There's canvas netting over the tree lines. Thermal scatter. I've got sketches. He sighed, tapped a few keys, and shook his head. Command says stand down, no recon flights, no asset risk for soft data. Orders are to reroute south. She nodded once, no argument, no raised voice, just turned and left. In the gear tent, the light was worse. She pulled her pack off the rack and checked the contents with practiced precision optic cloth. Wind chart, suppressed bolt assembly, ration sleeve half used. At the bottom of the side pouch was the radio locator, blinking faintly. She pulled it free, stared at it a moment, then set it on a flat crate and cracked it with the butt of her knife. The LED blinked once more before fading. She opened her field journal, found the sketch of the valley she'd marked 2 days earlier. 3 trucks angled behind a ridge, camouflage netting over the cabs. She had written the words, "converging routes" in the margin. She circled it again, harder this time. Underneath, in red pencil, "They don't see it." The wind outside was dry and hot as she stepped into it. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She didn't need to. Her gear was already on her shoulders. The flap of the tent closed behind her, but no one looked up. It wasn't a dramatic exit, just motion, quiet and clean. As she reached the brush line outside the compound, she paused once, pulled the small comms unit from her harness, and turned the dial. Static hissed softly through the earpiece. No requests, no alerts, no acknowledgement. She listened for a moment longer, then unplugged it, tucked it away, and kept walking. Hours later, she reached the edge of the village. Smoke had already blackened the sky in streaks. She didn't hesitate. She moved up into the ruined church, set her pack down in the shadows, and began building her hide. Rachel adjusted the optic dial a quarter turn to compensate for light drop. Shadows had deepened across the village, but the angles had grown sharper, not softer. She saw it in the way movement changed, squads bunching closer, their approach less aggressive, more patterned. The enemy no longer surged in waves. They crept now. Eyes were watching from the wrong places. They knew something was interfering. She didn't fire again. Instead, she lowered the scope, adjusted her elevation slightly, and scanned the rooftops with the naked eye. The upper corner of a shattered hotel had fresh dust on the ledge. The alley to the east held nothing but a door that hadn't been ajar yesterday. Still, there was no clean shape, no clear line to confirm. She waited. The faint sound of shifting rubble crept through the floor. A step, then another, just below. Rachel's hand moved to her thigh holster. She didn't rush. Her sidearm came up slowly, naturally. The barrel angled downward, finger resting alongside the frame. She didn't breathe for 3 full seconds, letting her body still completely. Another step on the stair, the creak of a rotted board. Closer now, maybe 5 feet below. She raised the weapon with both hands, stance wide despite the narrow space, and fixed her focus on the doorway leading to the upper landing. The enemy soldier breached the corner, rifle lifted, eyes still adjusting to the light. She fired once. The suppressed shot made less sound than his boot-scraping stone. He dropped instantly, forward, limp, his weight slamming into the wall. Dust drifted down in slow motes from the impact. Rachel stepped forward, caught the drag strap on his vest, and pulled him into the darkest corner of the steeple. His weapon, she set aside. His radio. She clicked off. There was no shake in her hands, no rush in her breath. She reset the pack near the window, returned to prone, and brought her rifle back to position. The comms unit in her vest hissed once. Static gave way to a half-transmission. Sector 3. Possible overwatch. Request. She reached for the volume knob but didn't respond. Instead, she tucked her free hand under the pouch flap near her ribs and pressed lightly against the object inside a half-burned photograph. Edges curled from heat, the faces mostly erased. Just the outlines of 3 figures in desert uniforms remained. She didn't look at it. She only grounded herself against the shape. Then she returned to the scope. Movement again. The door across the alley now had a shadow behind it. She adjusted her sightline and waited for the next mistake. The alley was quiet again, but the tension didn't lift. Sergeant Wynne crouched behind a crumbling wall, scanning the grid drawn hastily in the dirt. Every time he adjusted their position, something happened. The last two flanks they expected to be hot were clear. Not just clear, neutralized. Corporal Lewis tapped the edge of the map and nodded toward a ruined doorway across the courtyard. That was supposed to be a machine gun nest, he said. Intel showed debris and field of fire, but it's cold. Nguyen passed him a fragment of mirror, the kind they'd been using to peek corners. Lewis angled it low, caught a glint, and then a shape. A body, slumped, chest wound, blood dark on the tiles. That wasn't us, Lewis muttered. Nguyen said nothing, just kept watching. He shifted to the next mark on the map, a suspected sniper perched 2 blocks east. He looked up, eyes left. He ordered, just confirm shape, not position. Farley crawled forward, scoped the upper floor. Got movement, he whispered. Possible glass glint, far corner. Call it, Nguyen said, flat and quiet. Farley didn't hesitate. Sniper nest, 6-3 north. Call sign, black lid. Nothing moved. Not for 4 seconds. Then the figure in the window dropped backward. Silence followed. Farley whispered, "Okay, that's not luck." Lewis looked up at Nguyen. "Someone's playing this like chess. They're ahead of us." Nguyen exhaled. Slowly. He didn't smile. "We don't need evac. We need her to stay alive." No one argued. From then on, they changed tactics. Not by command, by instinct. Before each shift, they paused, watched the dust. If it moved against the flow, they adjusted. If the rooftops were too still, they waited. When they reached another junction, Nguyen held his hand up and set it low, not as a joke, not even as a question. "Follow the ghost." They did. At the next turn, Lewis raised the mirror again. The corner had been marked hot. The mirror caught no muzzle, just another body, half hidden by debris, face down, rifle nearby. Nguyen picked up a stone and rubbed it between his palms. "The unseen hand," he murmured. No one laughed. They kept moving, quieter now, more deliberate. The map changed less. The silence felt fuller, like someone else was in the room just before speaking. They never saw her, but they didn't need to. She was no longer myth, she was method, and they trusted it. The shot came from nowhere, not aimed, not measured, just chaos somewhere to the east. A panicked burst from a rooftop that shattered against the stone near her left flank. One fragment caught her just above the scapula, hot and sharp, angling through fabric and skin in a shallow arc. Rachel didn't cry out. She flinched, held her breath, and dropped lower behind the rise of the shattered bell base. Her hand came up, pressing instinctively to the point of impact. Blood was already soaking into the seam of her uniform. Not a full wound, more of a slice, but deep enough to bite. She blinked once, assessed the movement in her arm. Still functional, still anchored. Pain flared when she twisted, but it was manageable. Her IFAC pouch opened with a practiced jerk. She fumbled slightly, only one hand steady now, but found the dressing, ripped the sterile pack open, and pressed it to the wound. The pressure stung. She drew in a slow breath through her teeth and leaned forward, biting the edge of the tape roll with her molars, wrapping the bandage with her right hand and locking it in place. The blood was steady now, not gushing, just leaking, warm down her back and elbow. Wind moved through the broken steeple, stirring the edge of her laminated chart. The smudge from her hand left a dark arc across Sector 4. She didn't wipe it off. Her fingers went back to the scope. The lens still held the last alignment, but the parallax had shifted from recoil tension. She adjusted it 2 clicks, exhaled carefully, and settled in again. Outside, the rooftops swam in heat shimmer, somewhere, below the haze. Another team moved too fast, desperate repositioning, thinking the village was still theirs. She didn't look away from the scope. Her shadow, now sharp against the rear wall, swayed slightly as the light shifted. Dust particles floated around it. Not myth, just matter. "Not done," she whispered, lips barely moving. She laid her cheek back against the rifle stock, controlled her breath to slow the pain spike in her shoulder, and resumed overwatch. The rhythm returned. The angles cleared. Her eye stayed steady behind the glass. One more breath. One more target. And then another. The final push came in layers. Rachel saw it long before it reached the Marine's shadows slipping between walls. Coordinated spacing. The slow but certain rhythm of soldiers moving with purpose. It wasn't panic anymore. It was structure. A platoon-sized element, fanning through the east corridor and converging on the square. Lead elements marked with red cloth at the shoulder. Command trained. She rolled her shoulder back once. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, but the wrap held. The rifle stayed steady. Through the scope, she tracked a signalman directing from behind a vehicle husk. His hand was up, radio mic tucked into his cheek, eyes scanning. She adjusted elevation, let her breath fall in slow rhythm, and fired. He dropped behind the bumper, body folding awkwardly into the dust. Without waiting, she shifted 5 degrees right. A light machine gun team was setting up behind a collapsed wall. One fed the belt, the other steadied the tripod. She watched the pattern of their hands. 2 counts before feed she fired. The gunner jerked sideways, belt flying loose across the ground. Radio static cracked softly through her headset. She had turned it back on minutes ago, just in case. No voices, just the hum. She listened for a moment, then muted it again. Another pair moved through the alley's far edge, nearly out of sight. One carried a long antenna, the backup RTO. Rachel waited until the wind settled just enough to clear the shimmer from the glass. She fired. The man fell backward against the stone wall. Blood blooming across the corner like smoke. She rotated back to the western quadrant, caught movement from a second story. Another signal, an officer shouting downward, gesturing furiously. Her breathing was shallow now, arms starting to seize, but she steadied her hand. The shot went through the corner of the window. The figure dropped with a stuttered twist, his weapon clattering against the balcony rail. Then nothing moved. She reached into her pouch and pulled one final round. The casing had a faint scratch near the base, one she had carved with her knife a week earlier, marking it as last. She chambered it deliberately, slowly, feeling the bolt click forward. One last position remained, a barely visible sliver of movement through a fractured plaster window. The figure there leaned to aim. She timed it. 1 breath in, hold, let gravity settle the barrel, fire. The target collapsed behind the ledge. Rachel stayed prone. Her eye didn't leave the scope. Her breath returned in shallow waves, pain in her shoulder now constant. But the rooftops were still, the alleys empty. She didn't smile, just adjusted the lens again, checked for movement, and resumed the watch. No one would ever know how close it had been, but she did. Dust rose in low spirals as the helicopters touched down, blades kicking grit through the fractured remains of the square. The Marines didn't cheer. There were no shouts, no arms raised in victory, just movement, deliberate, slow, bone deep, tired. Medics guided the wounded forward, ducking under the rotors, slapping stretchers into place. Bandages pressed. IVs started. Vitals called out like prayer. Sergeant Wynne sat with his back to the stone wall, helmet in his lap, eyes fixed on the church steeple. It stood jagged and uneven against the smoke-tinted sky. Nothing moved up there. No flash. No figure. "She saved us," Farley said beside him, voice quiet but clear. "I don't care what they say." Wynne didn't answer, just kept looking. In the command tent, 2 hours later, a debrief scrolled across the main screen. The after-action log tagged the village grid as hostile contact, partial engagement, no Overwatch asset present. An intel officer clicked through the summary with a flat expression. There was no sniper assigned to that sector. He said, almost bored, no approval, no deployment. Corporal Lewis, bandaged and mud-streaked, leaned over the folding table and pointed at the aerial recon photo. "I saw a flash from that steeple. I know what glass looks like at range." The officer shrugged. Could have been shattered window panes. No friendly rounds logged from high-angle assets. It wasn't ours. No one argued further. There was nothing to file, nothing to name. Back in the village, the light had shifted again. Inside the church steeple, the dust had settled into long rays across the floorboards. The wind chart was gone. So was the rifle. But the rest remained a padded nest of fabric and sand, a faint smudge of dried blood near the eastern ledge. And one casing, still warm when a recovery tech found it. Hours later, he didn't pocket it. He didn't mark it for intel. He just stood there for a moment, holding the small brass shell in his palm, then placed it back down exactly where it had landed. Later, they'd tell stories. The squad would argue over who saw what, when the first shot landed, whether it was real. But none of them would forget the stillness, the rhythm, the impossibility of every right shot arriving just in time. The unseen hand, they'd call it. Or maybe just her. The village lay still. 2 weeks had passed since the last shot echoed down its fractured alleys, and now only the wind moved low, dry, brushing ash and grit across the rubble. The walls still bore the scorch of impact. Roof lines sagged, windows hung shattered and untouched, but no smoke rose anymore, no distant percussion, just silence. A fresh Marine unit rotated through, tasked with clearing remnants, confirming what had and hadn't survived. They moved with the methodical caution of those trained to expect the unexpected, even in quiet places. Lance Corporal Fisher ducked into the remains of the old church. The roof had collapsed further since the last sweep, but the main floor still held its strange symmetry rows of pews half buried in debris, shards of colored glass crunching underfoot. Sunlight slipped through the broken arch near the apse, casting a narrow beam across the far side of the nave. Behind the third pew, tucked carefully into a crack in the frame, he found the notebook. Dust covered most of the cover, but the spine was intact. The paper inside was water-warped, corners curled, ink faded in places, but the last page was still legible. Handwritten, precise, tight script. 16 rounds, 0 missed, do not mark. Fisher stood in silence, one gloved thumb brushing along the edge of the page. He looked up toward the shattered window where a single beam of light caught the floating dust. Footsteps behind him. Another Marine stepped into the aisle. "What is it?" the voice asked. Fisher didn't answer immediately. He closed the notebook slowly, slid it back where he found it, and pressed it down gently. "Just a ghost report," he said, stepping away. They left it there. No record was made, no name logged, but word spread anyway. Quiet, casual, passed between sips of water or lulls in patrols. Someone had held the line from that perch, someone who hadn't waited for orders or credit. No one had seen her, but they'd felt it, again and again. In time, the story would change. Some would say she fired from the clouds. Others would swear there was never anyone at all. But those who knew the dust, the angles, the rhythm of held breath, they would remember the silence before each enemy fell. The way the village had felt watched, protected, measured. And, in the light shaft that pierced the steeple's ruin, the dust kept moving, each mote drifting through the beam, caught in still air where a legend once lay prone and unblinking.